Go ahead, officer. Cuff me on my own land. That's exactly what she wants. The metal clicked around my wrist before I even finished the sentence, cold steel biting just enough to remind me this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a performance, and she was enjoying every second of it. The late afternoon sun hung low over my ranch, casting long shadows across the dry grass, the kind that crunches under your boots like old paper, and I could still smell the faint mix of diesel and hay from the tractor I'd shut off maybe 2 minutes earlier. That's how fast it happened. 1 second, I'm checking a loose fence post. Next second, 2 patrol cars roll up the gravel drive like they own the place, tires spitting dust into the air, lights flashing, but no sirens, just enough to make a statement. And standing right behind them, arms crossed, lips tight with that practiced HOA smile, was Karen Whitmore, HOA president, self-appointed ruler of anything she could see from her front porch. She didn't look at me like a neighbor. She looked at me like a problem she'd finally found a way to delete. That's him, she said, voice sharp enough to cut through the engine hum still ticking down behind me. He's been violating HOA regulations for months. Unsafe structures, unauthorized equipment, possible fire hazards. Fire hazards. I almost laughed at that one. Instead, I kept my mouth shut and let the officers do what they were already committed to doing. One of them, younger guy, maybe late 20s, jaw set like he'd practiced that look in the mirror, stepped in close. Sir, we need you to turn around. No hesitation. No questions. Just procedure. The older officer lingered a few feet back, eyes scanning the property, taking in the barn, the old red truck, the equipment shed with the faded warning decals peeling at the corners. I noticed his gaze pause there for half a second longer than normal. He didn't say anything. Not yet. The cuffs tightened with a second click, a little too snug, and I shifted my shoulders just enough to ease the pressure without making it look like resistance. The air felt different when you're standing still like that, hands locked behind you, every sound. Sharper, the wind brushing across the open fields, the distant creak of the windmill, even Karen's heels pressing into the gravel as she stepped closer, confident now, emboldened. I told you, she said, just loud enough for the officers to hear. This property doesn't meet community standards. He refused every notice. We had no choice. No choice. That was her favorite line. I could still see the bright orange violation stickers she'd slapped on my gate last week, the ones that peeled off too clean, like they were never meant to stick in the first place. The smell of adhesive still lingered on the wood if you got close enough. I didn't respond. Didn't look at her. Just stared straight ahead at the barn door, at the old brass alarm bell mounted above it, sun-faded but still solid, still wired, still exactly where it had been for years. The younger officer shifted his grip slightly, adjusting his stance like he expected something to happen. I could feel the tension in his hand, ready, waiting. The older one finally spoke, voice calm, measured. Ma'am, you said there were active hazards? Karen didn't miss a beat. Yes, that structure right there, she pointed, perfectly manicured nail aimed straight at my equipment shed, contains unregistered emergency devices and outdated systems that could endanger the entire neighborhood. I let out a slow breath through my nose, tasting dust and something else underneath it, something metallic, familiar. She thought she was calling in authority. She thought she was escalating. What she didn't know, she'd just handed it right back to me. The wind shifted just enough to carry the dry scent of hay and old wood through the yard, and for a second, everything slowed down, like the entire scene was waiting for someone to realize they had made a mistake. I stood there with my hands secured behind my back, feeling the steady pressure of the cuffs, not fighting it, not resisting, just letting the moment breathe. Karen kept talking, of course she did, her voice cutting through the quiet like she was reading from a script she had practiced all week. I documented everything, she said, holding up a folder thick with papers the edges. Crisp, the kind of paperwork that looks impressive until you actually read it. Unauthorized structures, non-compliant storage, and that alarm system right there is completely outdated and dangerous. She pointed again at the bell above my barn, the same bell that had been there longer than half the houses in this subdivision. The younger officer glanced at it, then back at me, then at Karen, clearly trying to piece together a situation that did not feel as urgent as it had sounded over dispatch. The older officer took a few slow steps forward, boots pressing into the gravel with a steady crunch, eyes scanning the barn, the shed, the wiring along the exterior wall. He was not looking for violations. He was looking for context. That is the difference experience makes. I could hear the faint hum of the windmill behind the ridge, the rhythmic creak that had become background noise to me over the years. But right now it sounded louder, sharper, like every detail was stepping forward one at a time. Karen shifted her weight, impatient. Officers, you cannot just stand there. He is clearly in violation. This entire property is outside HOA compliance. We have issued multiple notices. Notices. I remembered each one. Bright paper, bold print, stuck to my gate like warnings on a condemned building. I had peeled them off one by one, the adhesive leaving behind a faint chemical smell that lingered on the wood long after the paper was gone. I never responded, never called, never attended her meetings in that polished little clubhouse with matching chairs and artificial smiles. That bothered her more than anything else. People like Karen do not like silence. They need resistance to justify escalation. The younger officer finally spoke, his voice firm but uncertain. Sir, do you have any documentation regarding these structures or the equipment she is referring to? I turned my head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes without shifting my stance. I do, I said calmly, my voice steady, carrying across the yard without effort. It is inside the barn. Karen let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind that is more about control than humor. Of course it is, she said. He always claims he has paperwork. That is what they all say. They all say? I almost smiled at that. The older officer raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to slow the moment down. We will take a look, he said, his tone measured, neutral. He stepped toward the barn, eyes lifting again to that bell, the faded red paint, the thick wiring that ran along the beam, the kind of setup you do not see in a standard residential property. I watched him notice it, really notice it. That half-second pause again. That was all it took. The air felt different now, less tense, more curious. Karen did not catch it. She was too focused on the outcome she had already decided. I rolled my shoulders slightly, easing the pressure of the cuffs, and shifted my weight just enough to face the barn door. The wood was worn smooth in places from years of use, the handle polished by time and habit. I had opened that door thousands of times. Today would not be any different. You might want to read the labels carefully, I said, my voice low, almost casual. The younger officer frowned slightly, confused. The older one did not respond, but I saw the change in his posture, the subtle straightening, the kind that comes when something in your training starts connecting dots you did not expect to see out here in the middle of a quiet ranch. Behind me, Karen crossed her arms tighter, confident, certain, already picturing the report, the fines, the victory she thought was inevitable. She had no idea she was standing on the wrong side of it. The barn door creaked open with that low, familiar groan that had echoed across this land for decades. The sound steady and grounded, like it did not care who was standing outside or what they thought they knew. The older officer stepped in first, boots hitting the packed dirt floor with a dull thud, his eyes adjusting to the shift in light as the late afternoon sun filtered through the gaps in the wood, cutting long golden lines across the interior. The younger one followed, still holding my arm, but loosening his grip just enough to step forward, curiosity starting to override certainty. From where I stood, just inside the threshold, I could smell it all at once: oil, metal, old wood, and something faintly chemical, the kind of scent that sticks to equipment that has been used, maintained, and respected over time. Karen stayed outside, of course, hovering just beyond the doorway like she did not want to dirty her shoes, but still needed to control the scene. You see what I mean, she called out, her voice bouncing off the wood beams. Look at all this. Completely unregulated. The older officer did not answer. He was already moving deeper inside, slow, deliberate, his gaze traveling across the walls lined with equipment, neatly organized, labeled, not random, not abandoned, but maintained with a precision most people would not even notice. His eyes stopped on the panel mounted near the back wall, a heavy metal box with a faded federal marking barely visible under years of wear. He leaned in slightly, reading, not rushing, not guessing. That was the moment the air shifted again. The younger officer glanced at it too, his brow tightening as he tried to make sense of something that did not match the story he had been told. I took one step forward, the cuff still secure, but no longer the center of attention, and nodded toward the panel. Go ahead, I said calmly. Open it. He hesitated for a second, then looked at his partner. The older officer gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The latch clicked open, a sharp metallic sound that echoed just enough to carry outside, and inside the panel, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Clean wiring. Official tags. Inspection stamps. Not recent, but not neglected either. Maintained. Documented. Real. The younger officer leaned closer, reading out loud without meaning to. Fire Safety Relay System, Regional Compliance. His voice trailed off as he found the date, then the authorization line beneath it. The older officer stepped in beside him, his posture changing, not aggressive, not defensive, just aware now, fully present. He read it once, then again, slower this time. Outside, Karen shifted, clearly impatient, her heels scraping lightly against the gravel. Well, she called. Are you going to shut it down or not? The older officer did not respond to her. Instead, he turned slightly, looking back toward me, not as a suspect, not even as a homeowner anymore, but as someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. I held his gaze for a second, then nodded once toward the small shelf near the panel. The paperwork is right there, I said. The younger officer reached for it, flipping through pages that were worn at the edges but intact, official seals pressed into the paper, signatures that were not printed or copied but written, deliberate, permanent. The kind of documentation you do not fake because you do not need to. The barn was quiet now except for the soft rustle of paper and the distant wind outside. Karen stepped closer to the doorway, trying to see inside, her confidence starting to thin at the edges. What is taking so long? She snapped. No one answered her. The younger officer stopped flipping pages and looked up, confusion giving way to realization. The older one closed the panel slowly, his hand lingering on the metal for a brief moment, like he was confirming what he already knew. Then he exhaled, a slow, measured breath, and turned fully toward me. The weight of the situation had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And Karen still had not realized it. The older officer stepped out of the barn first, and the difference in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders squared not with authority, but with clarity, like the situation had finally settled into place in his mind. The younger officer followed a step behind, still holding the folder, his eyes moving between the pages and the ground, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood 5 minutes ago. I remained where I was, just inside the doorway, the cuffs still in place, but suddenly feeling more like a formality than anything else. The air outside had cooled slightly, the sun dipping lower, casting a warmer glow across the gravel and the dry grass beyond the fence line. Karen stood there waiting, arms crossed tight, impatience written all over her face. Well, she demanded, her voice sharp, expecting confirmation, expecting validation. Are you going to shut this down or not? The older officer did not answer right away. He took a slow step toward her, not aggressive, not confrontational, just deliberate. Ma'am, he said evenly, we need to clarify a few things. That was the first crack. I saw at the moment her expression shifted, just slightly, like a script had gone off track. Clarify, she repeated, her tone tightening. There is nothing to clarify. He is in violation. I have documented everything. The younger officer stepped forward then, holding out the paperwork she had not expected to see. These systems inside the structure, he said carefully, choosing his words, are not unauthorized. They are registered under a fire safety compliance designation. Karen blinked, just once, but it was enough. That is not possible, she snapped, her voice rising. This is private property. HOA jurisdiction applies here. The older officer shook his head slightly, not dismissive, just factual. HOA jurisdiction does not override state or federal safety designations. The wind picked up just enough to carry that sentence across the yard, and for the first time since she arrived, Karen did not have an immediate response. She glanced past them, trying to look inside the barn again, as if the answer might change if she stared hard enough. There must be a mistake, she said, but the confidence was thinner now, stretched. I stepped forward then, slow, controlled, the gravel shifting under my boots with that familiar crunch. The younger officer instinctively loosened his hold, not letting go yet, but no longer treating me like a threat. I stopped just a few feet away from them, close enough to see the tension in Karen's jaw, the way her fingers tightened against her arms. "No mistake," I said quietly. The older officer looked at me, waiting, not interrupting. I tilted my head slightly toward the barn. "That system has been inspected, maintained, and approved for years." Karen let out a short breath, something between a laugh and disbelief. "Approved by who?" she asked, the edge back in her voice, reaching for control again. That was the question she should not have asked. The older officer glanced back at the paperwork in the younger officer's hand, then back at me, his expression shifting from neutral to something more focused. He had already seen it. He just needed to hear it. The windmill creaked again in the distance, steady, rhythmic, like it had all day, like it would long after this moment passed. I let the silence sit for half a second longer than necessary, just enough to let it settle. Then I spoke. "By the department that oversees every fire safety system within a 50-mile radius of this county." Karen's eyes narrowed, confusion pushing against her certainty. "And what does that have to do with you?" she asked. I held her gaze, calm, steady, the same way I had faced worse situations without raising my voice. The older officer did not move. The younger one barely breathed. "Everything," I said. The word landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. And for the first time since she called those patrol cars, Karen was no longer in control of the story. Karen's mouth opened, then closed again, like the words she had lined up no longer fit the situation in front of her. The confidence that had carried her through every notice, every complaint, every smug step across my gravel drive was slipping, not all at once, but in thin layers you could almost see peeling away. The older officer shifted his stance slightly, turning his body just enough to face both of us, placing himself between assumption and fact. "Sir," he said, his voice calm, but now carrying a different kind of weight. "Can you explain your role in relation to these systems?" The younger officer finally released his grip completely, the cuffs still on my wrists but no longer held, no longer controlled. That small detail did not go unnoticed. I rolled my shoulders once, slow, easing the pressure, and let my hands rest behind me without tension. The air felt steadier now, grounded. "I can," I said. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. I nodded back toward the barn, toward the panel, the bell, the wiring that Karen had dismissed as clutter. That system is part of a rural fire response network. It was installed years ago when this county expanded its emergency coverage beyond the city limits. Karen let out a sharp breath, shaking her head immediately. "That is not relevant," she cut in, trying to regain footing. "This is a residential zone under HOA regulation. He cannot just install whatever he wants and claim it is official." The younger officer glanced down at the paperwork again, then back up, uncertainty replaced with something more concrete. "Ma'am, this is official," he said, quieter now but firm. "There are inspection stamps here from multiple years." The older officer continued, picking up where the facts led. "And the authorization signature," he paused, not because he needed to read it again, but because he was connecting it out loud, "matches the name on record." Karen frowned, her brow tightening, her eyes flicking between them, searching for the angle she had lost. "Whose name?" she demanded. The wind brushed across the field again, carrying the dry scent of dust and grass, the kind that settles into your lungs and stays there. I stepped forward one more time, slow, deliberate, the gravel shifting under my boots in that steady rhythm that had always calmed me more than anything else. The cuffs were still there, cold against my wrists, but they no longer defined the moment. I turned slightly, just enough for both officers to see me clearly. "Caleb Walker," I said. The name hung in the air for a second. The younger officer's eyes widened just a fraction, recognition sparking as memory caught up. The older officer did not react immediately, but I saw it in the way his jaw set, the way his posture adjusted, respect replacing neutrality. Karen blinked again, slower this time. "That does not mean anything," she said quickly, too quickly. "Anyone can sign a piece of paper." The younger officer shook his head, almost instinctively. "Not this kind of paper," he said. Silence settled over the yard, broken only by the distant creak of the windmill and the faint ticking of the cooling engine behind me. The older officer took one step closer, his voice lower now, more direct. "Sir, are you saying you were the one who authorized and inspected this system?" I met his eyes, steady, The same way I had met countless others in situations where clarity mattered more than volume. I did more than authorize it, I said. I let the pause sit, not for effect, but because it was the truth taking its place. I built the inspection protocol for systems like this across this entire county. The younger officer exhaled softly, almost a quiet release of tension he had not realized he was holding. Karen did not move. She stood there, arms still crossed, but the grip had loosened, the certainty gone. The structure she had built this entire situation on had just shifted beneath her feet, and for the first time, she could feel it. The silence stretched just long enough to make every small sound stand out. The wind brushing across the open field, the faint rattle of a loose hinge somewhere on the barn, the quiet shift of boots against gravel as both officers processed what I had just said. The younger one looked down at the paperwork again, this time not searching for errors, but confirming what was already there, tracing the signature line with his eyes like it suddenly carried more weight than the entire situation combined. The older officer exhaled slowly, then reached forward, not toward me, but toward the cuffs. "Let us take care of that," he said, his voice calm, almost respectful now. The metal clicked again, but this time it opened, the pressure releasing from my wrists in a way that felt less like relief and more like balance being restored. I rolled my hands forward, flexing my fingers once, feeling the circulation return as the cool air touched the skin where the steel had been. Karen stepped back half a pace without realizing it, her posture shifting from confrontation to something uncertain, something she had not planned for. "This is not over," she said quickly, the words coming out sharper than she probably intended. "HOA regulations still apply. He cannot just ignore community standards because of some outdated system." The older officer turned to her then, not abruptly, but with a clarity that cut through the tension more effectively than any raised voice could have. "Ma'am," he said, "this is not an outdated system. It is an active, registered component of a county-level fire safety network." The younger officer added, holding the paperwork up slightly as if the facts themselves needed to be visible. "And it has been inspected multiple times under official protocols." Karen shook her head again, but slower now, her confidence unraveling in real time. "That does not give him the right to violate HOA codes," she insisted, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something defensive, something smaller. I took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to speak without raising my voice, the gravel shifting under my boots in that steady, grounded rhythm. "Your codes do not override emergency infrastructure," I said. The words were simple, but they landed exactly where they needed to. The wind carried them across the yard, past the fence line, into the quiet space that had once felt like hers to control. The older officer nodded slightly, confirming it without needing to repeat it. "HOA guidelines cannot interfere with legally designated safety systems," he said, "and attempting to do so can create liability issues." That word hung in the air differently. Liability. Not a threat, not an accusation, just a fact with weight behind it. Karen's arms loosened at her sides, her fingers uncurling as if she had been holding onto something that no longer existed. She glanced back at her car, then at the officers, then at me, searching for some angle, some remaining ground to stand on. "I was protecting the community," she said, quieter now, almost like she was trying to convince herself. The younger officer shook his head slightly, not dismissive, just honest. "Protecting the community means understanding what is already in place to keep it safe," he said. The older officer stepped back, giving the space room to settle, the situation no longer escalating, no longer uncertain. The air felt different now, not tense, not charged, just clear. I rubbed my wrists once more, then let my hands fall naturally at my sides, the familiar weight of the land around me settling back into place. Karen stood there for another second, then another, the moment stretching just enough for her to realize there was nothing left to argue. No leverage, no authority, just the truth she had overlooked from the beginning. Karen's gaze drifted across the yard like she was seeing it for the first time, not as a problem to fix, not as a rule to enforce, but as something she had misjudged from the start. The polished certainty she carried in had faded into something quieter, something that did not quite know where to stand anymore. The gravel under her heels shifted as she adjusted her footing, a small sound, but in the stillness, it felt louder than before. The younger officer closed the folder carefully, not rushing, not dismissing it, but handling it with the kind of respect that comes from understanding what it represents. He handed it back to me without a word, and I took it, the worn edges familiar against my fingers, the weight of it steady, grounded in years of work that had never needed to prove itself until now. The older officer glanced once more toward the barn, toward the bell mounted above the doorway, its faded paint catching the last stretch of sunlight. "That system," he said, almost to himself but loud enough to carry. "It ties into the regional alert network, does it not?" I nodded once. "It does," I said. "It was designed to trigger early warnings across rural zones where response times run longer than city limits." The wind shifted again, carrying the faint metallic scent from inside the barn, mixed with the dryness of the field, the kind of smell you only notice when everything else has gone quiet. Karen let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering just slightly, the tension no longer feeding her, no longer pushing her forward. "No one informed the HOA about any of this," she said, her voice softer now, almost searching for something to hold on to. I looked at her, not with frustration, not with anger, just with the same calm I had held from the beginning. "It is not something the HOA needs to approve," I said. The younger officer nodded again, reinforcing it without stepping in front of it. "Emergency infrastructure operates outside local association control," he added. The statement landed clean, factual, without edge. Karen glanced down at the ground, then back up, her eyes moving between us, measuring, recalculating. "I was told everything in this area had to meet community guidelines," she said, quieter still, the conviction replaced with something uncertain. The older officer folded his arms loosely, not defensive, just settled. "Guidelines are not the same as jurisdiction," he said. That word settled into the space like a marker, drawing a line that had not been clear to her before. The ranch stood the same as it always had, the fence line stretching out across the dry grass, the barn solid, the windmill turning slow and steady in the distance. Nothing had changed out here. Only the understanding of it had. I stepped back slightly, giving the space room again, the gravel shifting under my boots in that steady rhythm that had never failed me. The cuffs were gone, the pressure gone, but more than that, the imbalance was gone. Karen stood there for a moment longer, her posture no longer rigid, no longer commanding, just still. The younger officer adjusted his stance, looking between us one last time before stepping back toward his patrol car, the situation no longer requiring his attention in the way it had when they first arrived. The older officer lingered a second longer, his gaze returning briefly to the barn, then back to me. There was no question in his expression now, only acknowledgement. Behind him, Karen remained where she was, not speaking, not moving, as the weight of everything she had set in motion settled into place around her. The ranch was quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. This one carried clarity, and she could feel it. The last of the sunlight stretched low across the ranch, turning the dust in the air into a soft golden haze, the kind that makes everything look still even when it is not. The younger officer opened the door to his patrol car, but did not get in right away, pausing with one hand on the frame, as if replaying the last few minutes in his head. The older officer stood a few feet from me, his attention no longer split, no longer questioning, just settled into quiet understanding. Karen had not moved. She remained near the edge of the gravel, arms no longer crossed, hands hanging loosely at her sides like she had forgotten what to do with them. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was final, the kind that follows when there is nothing left to argue and no authority left to lean on. I flipped through the paperwork once more out of habit than necessity, the familiar texture of the pages grounding, the ink, the stamps, the signatures all exactly where they had always been. Years of inspections, approvals, field notes written in steady handwriting that did not rush because it did not need to. I closed the folder and rested it against my side. The older officer spoke again, his tone measured, carrying the weight of procedure now that everything had aligned. "Ma'am, based on what we have reviewed, there is no violation here that falls under criminal or safety enforcement," he said. He did not raise his voice, did not emphasize the words, but they carried further than anything Karen had said since she arrived. The younger officer added quietly, "And any attempt to interfere with this system could create complications beyond HOA authority." Karen swallowed, her gaze shifting from one officer to the other, then finally settling on me. For the first time, there was no challenge in her expression, no accusation, just a flicker of realization that she had stepped into something far bigger than a list of neighborhood rules. "So that is it?" she asked, her voice lower now, almost careful. The older officer gave a small nod. "That is it," he said. The wind moved across the field again, brushing through the tall grass in slow waves, the sound soft, steady, familiar. The younger officer stepped into his vehicle, the door closing with a solid, grounded thud that echoed briefly before fading into the open air. The older officer lingered 1 second longer, then turned to follow, pausing just enough to give me a brief nod, not formal, not exaggerated, just acknowledgement. Then he was gone too, boots on gravel, door opening, engine starting, the patrol cars easing back down the drive the same way they had arrived, but without urgency, without assumption. The dust they stirred up drifted slowly, settling back onto the ground like nothing had happened at all. Karen remained where she was, watching the cars disappear past the fence line, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. The ranch returned to its natural rhythm, the windmill creaking, the barn standing quiet, the air carrying that familiar mix of dust and sun-warmed wood. I turned slightly, adjusting my grip on the folder, and took a slow step back toward the barn. The gravel shifted under my boots, steady, certain. Behind me, Karen finally moved, one step, then another, but not toward me, not toward the barn, just back toward her car. No words, no final remark, just the quiet realization settling in as the distance between us grew. And out here, where everything runs on time, pressure, and preparation, that was the only outcome that ever really mattered. The ranch settled back into its rhythm the way it always did, slow and steady, like nothing that happened here could ever really shake it for long. The last light of the day stretched across the fence line, catching on the worn wood and the metal hinges of the gate, turning everything into shades of gold and shadow. I stood there for a moment, listening, not to anything specific, just to the quiet returning piece by piece. The wind moved through the grass. The windmill turned with that same familiar creak, and somewhere off in the distance, a truck passed along the county road, its sound fading just as quickly as it came. I walked back toward the barn, the folder still in my hand, the weight of it unchanged, steady, reliable, the same as it had been for years. The door was still open, the interior dim now as the sunlight pulled away, but everything inside remained exactly where it belonged. The panel, the wiring, the bell mounted above the beam, each piece part of a system that had never needed attention from anyone who did not understand it. I stepped inside and set the folder back on the shelf, sliding it into place with the others, the edges lining up neatly like they always had. There was a comfort in that order, in knowing that everything was documented, accounted for, built to hold up when it mattered. I reached up and rested my hand briefly against the metal of the panel, cool now in the evening air, the surface worn smooth in. Places from years of checks and maintenance. It had done its job. It always did. Outside, I heard the faint sound of a car door closing in the distance, softer now, farther away. Karen was leaving. No announcement. No final word. Just the quiet retreat of someone who had finally run out of ground to stand on. I stepped back out into the yard, pulling the barn door closed behind me, the latch settling into place with a soft, familiar click. The air had cooled, carrying that clean, dry scent that only comes at the end of a long day. I walked across the gravel, each step steady, the crunch under my boots the same sound it had been earlier, only now it carried none of the tension that had filled the space before. The ranch stretched out in front of me, unchanged, the fence line holding, the land steady, the systems in place doing exactly what they were designed to do. Nothing here needed to prove itself. It never had. I paused near the center of the yard, looking out toward the horizon where the last light was fading, the sky shifting into deeper shades of blue. This place had seen years of work, years of inspections, years of quiet responsibility that did not ask for recognition, only for consistency. People like Karen saw rules. They saw control. They saw something to enforce. They never saw the structure underneath, the systems that kept everything running long before they arrived, and would keep running long after they left. I took a slow breath, the air cool and steady in my lungs, and let it out just as slowly. There was no anger left, no need for it. Just clarity. Out here, authority does not come from a title or a clipboard. It comes from knowing what you built, why it exists, and how it holds when pressure shows up uninvited. The wind moved again, brushing across the field, steady as ever. I turned back toward the house, the gravel shifting under my boots, the sound grounded, certain. They brought the law to my land. They just did not realize. I helped write the rules it answers to.